Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell, and I'm pleased to have Jim Cameron as our guest today. So welcome, Jim. You've recently published the second edition, second volume, Cranbrook Then and Now, the collected works. And Jim, it's great to have you here as a guest. I think you're the first returning guest that we've had on Talking Kootenay Books, so great to have you back.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, it's nice to be here again. As you say, second time around.
So what motivated you to put the second volume?
Well, you know, when I put out the first volume, I used a number of the articles that I've written over the years for the Cranbrook Daily Townsman. When I say a number, I used maybe about 1/4 of them,
okay,
which left a whole lot of articles yet to work with. So I went through and picked out, about another 70 of my favorites and came up with volume 2.
Excellent. It's a great read, and some outstanding characters that appear in this second volume as well. Really talks about some of the colorful characters that sort of have graced the history of Cranbrook. Any that stick out in your mind that you said favorites? So,
yeah, you know, there's quite a cast of characters over the years that have come through Cranbrook and helped us become what we are. Amongst the many that stick out, and actually this book, you know, as opposed to my first book, probably deals with more people.
okay.
You know, the first one was a lot of places, and there's a lot of places and things in this book. But yeah, I had a lot of fun reading and researching a number of people, including, well, we've got the Baker family itself. I mean, James Baker, our town founder, I dealt with him in the first volume, but his brothers, Samuel Baker, who, amongst other things, discovered Lake Albert in, well, when I say discovered, let's say found Lake Albert in Africa, and named it for his friend Albert, the consort of Queen Victoria. He had quite a fascinating history.
Well, the Bakers certainly made an impression in Cranbrook, but interestingly enough, you can hardly go to a community throughout the whole valley, throughout the East and West Kootenays, that you don't see some reference to Baker, so that sort of talks to their influence.
Well, I mean, to be honest, you can go throughout the world and find a number of references to the Baker family, including, you know, I mean, we could start with Baker Mountain down on the coast, right as far as Ceylon, where the Baker family had a tea plantation for a number of years. Samuel Baker was the governor of Khartoum.
Okay.
In fact, he was a governor of Khartoum not too long before Charles Gordon, who was massacred there with all his men in an uprising. Another brother, Valentine Baker, and in fact, the son of our local James Baker was named Valentine Hyde Baker. He went by Hyde Baker. His uncle Valentine was credited as being the bravest soldier England ever had, which is quite a statement.
With all that world exposure and so forth, how do you think they ended up in Cranbrook?
Well, funnily enough, James Baker, who was probably the most bookish of the group, he spent a fair amount of time in London working with a number of the clubs there, and kind of being a helpmate to a number of really well-known and rich individuals there. And he himself came from a very wealthy family. He just out of nowhere, after he finished with the Crimean War, he was a soldier in the Crimean War, just up and told his wife and his kids that they were going to move to the wilds of British Columbia, which they did. They came to Skookumchuck for a few years and then came on to Cranbrook here, and basically became the first storekeepers in this area, just not too long, well, a number of years after the Wild Horse Gold Rush.
Okay. So he eventually did return to England, right?
Yeah, you know, he became MP for the Kootenay area, and he spent a lot of time in Victoria. He didn't really spend a lot of time right here in Cranbrook once he got his farm set up. He left that mostly to his son, Hyde Baker, and he returned to England 1905, not too long before he died.
Let's talk about one of the other colorful characters that sort of jumped out at me, and that's the namesake of Wardner. That's Jim Wardner, James Wardner. What a colorful guy he was. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, James Wardner was probably the most colorful of the bunch. He first came to prominence in my research as he was a medical officer in the Civil War for the Union Army. From there, he ended up in New York at an area called the 5 Points, which was the most brutal gang crime-ridden area of New York. And he became an apothecary there, worked in a drugstore, selling all kinds of drugs and probably for the wrong purposes. And he got hooked up with some pretty evil characters there, but he came out of that rather unscathed. He started selling an anti-kicking cow milking stool and machine, which was supposedly a safe bet not to get booted by the cow. But sadly, his wife's maid was knocked senseless on the first trial. Nonetheless, he ended up, she survived. He ended up in a town down in New York selling, he decided that if he sold sugar for less than he bought it, he could make money, which he did. He did quite well at it, at selling candy and sugar. He moved on to Cape Town. He was in Cape Town, South Africa. He was in Dawson City. He spent time in a little place called Eagle City, which is about 2 or 3 hours drive from here in Idaho, not too far from Wallace, Idaho. He spent time there with Wyatt Earp, actually, who had come up that way, trying to get away, I think, from his whole reputation after the OK Corral shootout down in Tombstone. So from there, he ran into a couple of friends, a fellow by the name of Sullivan and a fellow by the name of Kellogg, that were prospectors. And they were right in the middle of prospecting an area down in Idaho there, which became known as the Bunker Hill Mine, and was one of the richest finds in the entire territory. But at the time, they were a little down on their luck. There was the two of them and a mule. And Wardner heard they were off in the bush, and he headed out and found them because he knew them. He just wanted to touch base and hang out with the boys. As it turns out, while he was there, the mule, one afternoon, they caught the mule just staring up across the river at the mountain. And they had a good look, and they realized the mule had seen something pretty shiny, which turned out to be gold. And Kellogg and Sullivan immediately laid out the claim for the gold. At the same time, Wardner laid out the water rights. He didn't really tell them. They were all happy about it and said, we'll cut you in on a little on this. He said, well, you're going to cut me in a lot because I own all the water. So he did quite well there. He eventually started the town of Wardner, Idaho, shortly after that, and then came up further north here and started our own Wardner, British Columbia, in the hopes at the time that it was going to become the depot for the CPR, which it didn't. It ended up in Cranbrook. Of course, it was spelt the end for the town of Wardner. But then he moved on to really found the town of Fairhaven, Washington, which is now a large historic district of Bellingham.
Yeah, colorful character all around.
Yeah,
and
really
we could talk about him all day because he's got stories like he was involved in the steamboating and so forth on the Kootenay, and it's amazing all the things that he had his fingers in. So.
Yeah, he has a book, and it's well worth a read. Yeah. It's a great book.
I've read his book. It's the essence of self-promotion. I would have to say that.
But he had a good way of telling a story, and he had a lot of stories to tell.
Yeah. So Jim, I just want to talk about your columns. So you've written, I think you told me, around 400 columns for the Daily Townsman. So once a column comes out, what's usually the reaction? What happens?
Well, the interesting thing, and maybe kind of part of the problem sometimes, which is alleviated with the book, is that I'll write a column. I'll do a lot of research and write it. And once it's printed, I'll run into a whole lot of people, or they'll contact me and say, hey, I know something about that. Right. Of course, by then, technically, it's too late. I've already written about it, which is one of the reasons I thought, I'm going to put out a book, because I could go back and do a whole lot of updating, and add things, all kinds of interesting facts and trivia that I didn't know in my original, approach to it.
So tell me about how you get all the photos for your book, because in your first book, it was full of great historical photos. Second book, again, lots of great photos. Does that come through the contacts that you have and maybe some of the input from readers as well?
Yeah, both those things. And of course, the local, we have local resources here. The Cameron Townsman has been a huge help. I spent hours and hours combing through their old newspaper collection. which now has been, I think, moved and digitalized with the Cranbrook History Center, who are also a really excellent resource. But you know, I think it started with me just going down in the basement of my house and looking through the family photos. We've been around this area for about over 100 years. And there was always a lot of picture takers in the family. So I had a lot of my own photos that once I figured out what they were, I thought, well, this is cool, I can use these. And family, friends, and especially now that I've been doing it for 10 years or so, I have people just donate, you know, old family photos that, you know, they don't really know what they are, they don't want them. So I oftentimes avail myself of those and then move them on to the Cranbrook History Center.
So I have to ask you a question because, you know, we live in this digital age, and taking photos is just like something that everybody does with their smartphone. However, I think we're not capturing those images or saving those images. Do you think that'll impact us somewhere down the road when it comes to sort of maintaining or recording history?
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to impact it. You know, so much of what I was dealing with was hard copy. Yeah. You know, and it's just not out there. I even, you know, I find myself guilty of that. I'll take 50 photos and look at them a year later and go, I don't want those, I just delete them. And there it goes. Or another thing that happens frequently is people don't record what the actual image is of. Right. So it can be a very personal thing in a place and a time that is completely unknown years later. Right. I think not only the photos, Keith, you know, but the written things. So much of what I've used, aside from newspaper accounts and you know, books and things like that, is letters and diaries, right? You know, and things like that. And harder to find. I'm sure there's still people out there that keep journals, but not as many.
Right. And simply sending an email quite isn't the same as writing a letter as far as a historical record, right? Yeah,
you know, emails tend to be a little more formal, even though I think people are a little more careful because they know it's out there. Sometimes, you know, those personal letters, there's a lot of pretty interesting information in there.
So let's just talk about your first book, because when it came out, people were pretty excited to have a book about Cranbrook. Now you followed up with the second volume. What was the reaction to that first book?
It was good. I'm sold out of my first printing, having a good look at maybe doing a second printing here. I had a number of people say, which I agree with, there's just not many history books written about Cranbrook. You can go to Nelson or Fernie, even a number of towns in the area, and there's a fair amount of literature about their past. Cranbrook, for some reason, there just wasn't a lot out there. So it was a wide open field, which was great, you know, easy to break into. And even now, I think there's, as you mentioned, I've got so much information from articles I've written. I'm sure I could do another 2 books if I wanted quite easily.
So you currently aren't doing the column in the Townsman. Do you think that'll come back, or is that still just something that's you're taking a vacation from?
Well, you know, I really did want a vacation. I wanted to work on my second book and just take some time to collect everything I had, organize it properly. It gets a little thrown asunder when you're working on it at the time, you know. Yeah, I'm sure I could. I know if I went to the Townsman and asked, I'm sure we could get something going. The question of how long, you know, how long is the hard copy print going to be here? So, you know, if down the road things are still the way they are, it'd be fun to do some more for sure.
Sure. So what's the difference between Volume 1 and Volume 2? I know you mentioned the people. Anything else?
Well, not a lot. I mean, I had I was quite successful with Volume 1, so I really kept the layout and the design is pretty similar. I think if you're reading Volume 1 and enjoying it, you could slide into Volume 2 quite easily without any kind of a shock to your system.
And the thing that I admire is that your book is very consistent. You know, your first book, second book, they have a consistent look to them. So obviously you use the same designer and so forth. So it seemed to go together really well.
Yeah, you know, I had a real good designer, Warren Clark, who lives near Balfour. And has done a number of books, and did my first one, and I was really pleased, and he had some time and agreed to do the second one. And yeah, anything in there that looks nice is his work. You know, I didn't have a lot to do with that. A great guy to work with, took my suggestions and ran with them. And luckily I had a lady named Betsy Brierly, who really knows her stuff, to do all my proofreading.
Okay.
Because that's quite a challenge too.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, Jim. Great to see the second volume out. And what's the title again?
It's Cranbrook Then and Now.
And you call it The Collective Works. Why did you call it The Collective Works?
Really just because so many of them were smaller, shorter stories that I had written over the years, you know, and put them all together in a bunch. So yeah, Cranbrook Then and Now, Volume 1 and Volume 2 on the shelves.
Congratulations. Great to have you as our guest on Talking Kootenay Books. First author we've had back a second time, and congratulations on your project. It's a great read.
Well, thank you, Keith. Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me here, and hope to be back again.
Good. And this is Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host. And today I'm really pleased to introduce our guest, Martina Danzer. Martina, I understand you're from the Kimberley area.
Yes, I am.
Could you just tell me exactly where you live?
My ranch is located west of Tata Creek in the Lost Dog Valley, so just 35-minute drive outside of Kimberley.
Yeah, the reason I wanted to know that is because it ties in so nicely with your new book that you've just released. So your book is I Will Carry You to Power, and so it's talking about equine therapy, is that correct?
Yeah, it's definitely talking about that, and also how horses can help to heal trauma.
I see. So let's just talk a little bit about your new book.
Sure.
You recently launched it, right?
Yes, I did.
So what was the initial reaction to the book?
Oh, I'm just overwhelmed by the community support. People are just very enthusiastic about it. There seems to be a need for society in general to speak about trauma right now. Mm-hmm. And especially under this whole piece of development, what's happening with our youth right now, how they're dealing with different mental health challenges and also with the violence.
Okay, so we're going to explore that a little bit later here in more detail. But tell me what motivated you to go from the fact that you've got horses, you've got a ranch, and now you've got a book about it. So how did that all come together?
Well, I didn't start out with horses,
okay.
but I married a cowboy.
Okay.
And he lived in the wilderness with a herd of horses, so that's how I ended up with horses. And I learned that I was deadly afraid of them. I couldn't even touch them. My body literally fell apart. I had such severe physical reactions that nobody could explain because I never had an experience with horses before.
Okay.
So that took me on a journey basically for the next 20 years to study what was behind all of that, because at some point I realized it was really not about the horses. Mm-hmm. It was just the response of my body, what happened to me when I was in the presence of a powerful being.
I see. So you took that experience and you've documented it, but tell me how did your seminar or series of seminars work, and how did that translate into your new book?
Okay. Well, most people who are coming to my place, like local people who are coming to my place, they are families, they are youth and their guardians, and they come and see me and the horses. I have a herd of 7 horses. So they engage in experiential learning exercises on the ground. And while they're doing so, they learn about authentic leadership, they learn about emotional intelligence, they learn about where are pieces to improve and where to get stronger, where to become softer. And the horses always give them immediate feedback. And I think that's probably the biggest advantage of equine facilitated therapy. The moment we collapse belief systems, the moment we change our behavior, the horses immediately respond to that frequency and change their own behavior.
So how long have you been doing this?
Well, almost, let's say, I've been engaging with the horses more in an adventure type based context first, and in a therapeutic context now with the horses for about 12 years, mm-hmm. whereas my other background as an art therapist builds the foundation and is the background for that.
So is your book an extension of that seminar, or are you telling your personal story?
It's a mix of it. Okay. I use my personal story to just really speak about trauma and the form of trauma, and that it really relates so strongly right now and ties into all the behaviors that we are seeing in our youth especially, but in other people as well. You know, the anxiety, the moods, the depression, addiction, and just the newest findings of epigenetics that is telling us that trauma is being passed on through the DNA.
I see. Okay, so can you talk about any of the success stories, or how this positively has affected people that maybe have taken your seminar?
You bet, absolutely. Yes, I have several success stories for sure. In some of the youth that I'm working with from the high school in Kimberley, that after about 6 sessions, that the counselors, the families, the teachers could really tell the difference in behavior and also in how the marks and picked up in the results at school, and how most importantly, how the youth felt about themselves.
So you saw quite a transformation then.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so let's just talk about the process of preparing your book. You told me that you had a mentor. Who was that mentor, and how did she help?
Many people probably know her. It's Luann Armstrong, who is a very renowned writer, editor, writing coach who lives at Kootenay Lake. She's a very good friend of mine. And I participated in one of her seminars, and then she became my writing coach and also my editor.
Excellent. So what was the process as far as length? How long did it take you to start the book and to finish?
From start to end, it was about 4 years. And the challenge of it was definitely the step of publishing the piece, because it's also my personal story, and Luann Armstrong actually specializes in those pieces of what it means for people to write their personal story and then make it public, because it's just seen through my filter. So but it speaks about real people, right? Like my family or my friends, and so it evokes strong emotions in the writer about that morality of coming out with a story and making it available to the public, rather than keeping it quiet or not saying anything, especially when it's in the context of a traumatic experience.
Right. Okay, so you work with a lot of people to get this all together and so forth. You mentioned the reaction has been very positive. You recently launched your book. What plans do you have in the future for the book?
Well, the biggest piece is the book is really a fundraiser. We are planning, like right now we're in the process of starting a nonprofit society, because our biggest challenge is that there are simply not the funds to make it possible for the youth from our communities to participate in that education of emotional intelligence and authentic leadership. So the nonprofit society that we are calling Painted Horse is really looking for support in terms of either volunteers, donations, sponsoring youth so they can participate in those trainings, and we can expand it and make it bigger and actually bring groups in and really teach them, give them those skills, because it's not anything that anybody's teaching right now. And we definitely didn't learn it.
Okay. So maybe just expand just a bit on the fundraising aspect of the book.
So right now I have just community members who have experienced the personal benefits of equine therapy and art therapy. So they stepped up and actually they just fund youth right now. So out of their personal pocket, they say, okay, who do you have, who needs support, and they pay for that. But they can only do so much, of course. So all the proceeds from the book are going towards that and sponsoring youth again. And what we are really looking for is like business people, parents, anybody who feels called, who would like to assist us maybe with the nonprofit, who would like to donate, for example, items that we could auction off, like on the internet, and also just who would like to come forward and say, hey, I would like to sponsor a youth for 5 sessions or for 2 sessions or whatever, anything like that.
Okay, so it sounds like there's an opportunity for the local community to get involved as well.
Really, that would be awesome. That's what I'm looking for, and really bringing awareness to that piece, that it's not so much that we have good programs in place for youth to assist them, like what can you do, like how can you protect yourself from bullying, or how can you, whatever, those kind of pieces. But what we are not looking at is what lies underneath all of that. Why is all of this stuff coming up right now, all of a sudden?
Okay.
And
so with that thought in mind, why horses? Why are you using horses for the therapy?
awesome question. The horses are non-predatory animals, so they use their whole bodies as sensing devices. We are living in a society where we have been taught that everything needs to be solved through our head. Everything is coming from the left side of our brains. Now, right now, what we are learning is that science is showing us that we have actually 3 brains that we are aware of. One is the heart brain, one is the gut brain. And the capacity of these 2 brains is way more potent than the brain power in our head, actually. Right. Now, the horses, because they're non-predatory animals, this is how they survive. Their whole body becomes a sensing device. They gotta know what it means if someone comes into their field. They know how to deal with the stimulation of their nervous system. So as the people or the kids engage with the horses, they learn how the effect they have, and their emotions affect the horse. So if they come in angry, the horses don't want to be near them because it gives the signal out that, oh, you are not safe for me. And then, so while we are teaching the kids then through breath and through certain techniques to even just acknowledging the emotion. They don't even need to get rid of it. But the moment they say, wow, I'm afraid, wow, I'm sad, I'm angry, whatever it is, the horses immediately adjust their behavior. Right. They relax, they come in, they put their nose onto the kids' hearts. I mean, it's really something to see that.
Right.
Yeah.
So amazing. So, well, thanks very much for sharing that, and congratulations on your new book. It's a fascinating topic, and obviously one that you're very passionate about. We wish you continued success. My name is Keith Powell, and this has been Talking Kootenay Books.